Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in for this broadcast of what was supposed to be my Sunday, June 21st sermon. For those of you that were there on Sunday, you know that the live stream unfortunately failed a few times, and then my internet connection was so poor I couldn't even upload my video that I recorded afterwards, and then found out that the video itself was poor quality. So I'm re-recording the Sunday sermon here in my living room. So in case you're like, that's not where he was on Sunday, and that's not the shirt he was wearing, that's why. My wife and kids are gone, but my dog is here. So you might hear barking, you might hear scratching or fidgeting at some point during this. That is just life right now. That is the life of live streaming, recording, uploading, broadcasting, all that good stuff. So it might be a little noisier than usual. I'll try to ignore it. Please try to ignore it with me. If you regularly attend Southeast City Church, thank you so much for being here. Hi, family. Love you, miss you, hope you're doing well, praying for you. If you don't normally call Southeast City Church your home, or you don't identify as a Christian, welcome. I'm so glad that you're here. Hopefully many of you are watching this live at 6 o'clock, but if you're not and you're watching it later, that's awesome. I'm glad that you're here. So thank you for being here, and thank you for tuning in for this sermon that I believe is very important. For those of you that get our email newsletter, you were probably anticipating I was going to preach on Psalm 23. And then you saw on Sunday that no, I was going to preach a little bit more on justice. So I was starting to prepare a sermon on Psalm 23 and felt the Lord saying, no, there's a few more things I want you to say about justice. So we will get to Psalm 23 and the Psalms later in the summer, probably as a series, obviously not looking at all the Psalms, but at a few select songs. But for the next 2 weeks, I'm going to talk a little bit more about justice. So last week and the week before, I talked about justice broadly, racial justice broadly. Is racism still a problem? Why is racism wrong? How can we advocate for and do racial justice? Tonight and next week, I want to talk about not racial justice specifically, but justice in general. And I want to drill down on two concepts for how we can do the work of justice in a distinctly, uniquely Christian way. So how do we follow Jesus in doing justice? So tonight we're going to talk about remaining salty, and this coming Sunday we're going to talk about the power of love, radically loving our neighbors and radically loving our enemies. So tonight's remaining salty, and obviously I'm going to explain what that means in a minute, but first I'm going to pray. God, thank you so much that we can come together like this. It's not ideal, it's not the greatest, but it's better than nothing. So God, thank you for this. And God, I thank you that in a world that is polarized and fragmenting and full of tragedy and suffering, it seems, right now, in a world where there's just so many challenges and difficulties, I thank you that you are not silent, but you speak to us, you show us the way. You give us wisdom to live good, godly lives that glorify you and help others. So as we talk about justice tonight, God, show us the way. Show us what is right and good and true. And I pray in everything I say, it would be accurate, it would bring glory to you, and it would be helpful for your people. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. So for remaining salty, I'm going to be reading out of Matthew 5. That's not the only passage we'll look at tonight, but it's the most prominent passage. Matthew chapter 5, verses 13 to 16, and this is, of course, taken from Jesus' famous Sermon on the Mount. He says this, "You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt should lose its taste, how can it be made salty? It's no longer good for anything but to be thrown out and trampled on by men. You are the light of the world. A city situated on a hill cannot be hidden. No one lights a lamp and puts it under a basket, but rather on a lampstand, and it gives light for all who are in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before men, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father in heaven." So Jesus is saying to his church, to his people, you are to be salt and you are to be light. That's That's a lot of why you're here on the earth, to be salt and to be light. Now, light we can somewhat understand, but what in the world does it mean to be salt? What does it mean for me to be salty? Kind of in our common vernacular, if somebody is salty, they're sarcastic and sassy, and that can't be what Jesus is talking about here. Now, Craig Blomberg, a New Testament scholar, in his commentary on Matthew, he says this: of the numerous things to which salt could refer in antiquity, its use as a preservative in food was probably its most basic function. Jesus thus calls his disciples to arrest corruption and prevent moral decay in their world. So salt was a preservative in the first century, for many years before and many years after. And so Jesus is saying, I want you to be a preservative in the world. I want you to arrest corruption, and I want you to prevent moral decay. And then he says, I want you to be light. All right, the world is full of darkness, and I want you to shine light. Jesus came into the world not just to rescue us from our sins, not just to rescue us from judgment and hell and reconcile us to God. Jesus came into the world to show us a better way of living and being. We have been prisoners, slaves of the kingdoms of greed and power and control and selfishness and lust, and Jesus came to set us free from all of that and to bring us into the kingdom of God. He came to show us what the human life is meant to look like. He came to show us what life lived under the rule of God looks like, what a life lived out of love for God and out of love for neighbors looks like. And so Jesus came to show us a better way of living and being. And he says, when you follow me, you will be light. You will show the world a better way of living and being. So I want you to arrest corruption and moral decay, and I want you to show the world a much better way of being. And if you come out of conservative church circles, you'll often hear the refrain that this is done through preaching. We preach the word of God, and that shows people the light, and that prevents the moral decay of society. But Jesus doesn't actually talk about preaching here. Now, preaching is important, obviously. I'm doing it right now. And Jesus, in talking about being salt and light, is preaching. This is the Sermon on the Mount. So we know that Jesus is not anti-preaching, but what he emphasizes here is good works. He says, I don't just want you to preach about this life. I want you to actually go out and live it. I want you to show through your good, righteous lives what life lived under the rule of God looks like. I want you to push back the darkness with light. In other words, the church is meant to be a force for good in the world. And this necessarily entails justice. It necessarily entails justice. If you historically, right, to take a historical example, if you live somewhere where your black neighbors are being lynched, you can't just not lynch people yourself and preach against lynching. You need to advocate for lynching to be made illegal. You need to speak truth to power, and you need to rescue people from being lynched. You need to do the work. You don't just preach, you do the work as well. And the amazing thing here is that Jesus says this actually enables effective, successful preaching. He says, men may see your good works and give glory to your Father in heaven. He says, in other words, people will look at your life, and your life will be so radically different and convicting and challenging and intriguing that people will come to you and will ask you, what is the source of your life? This life you're living, what is the source of it? What inspires it? What motivates you? Who are you following? Who is your Lord? And you'll get to tell them about me, Jesus says. You'll get to tell them about salvation in my name, the forgiveness of sins, reconciliation with God. You'll get to tell them about the love of the Heavenly Father for everyone on the earth, made in His image. And he says, and people are going to come to know your God. People are going to come to know your Father. In other words, Jesus is saying, your good works are necessary for the preaching. Your testimony, the way you live, is necessary to gain a hearing for your preaching. People will be challenged by your life, and then they'll hear your story, they'll hear about me, and they'll come to believe in me. They'll come to believe in God. Now here's the thing. Earlier in the sermon, Jesus talks about, blessed are you who are persecuted for righteousness' sake. So we know that our living well in the world, loving our neighbors, doesn't always result in a good hearing, doesn't always result in people appreciating us and treating us well. There will be persecution, but Jesus balances it out. He says there's going to be some persecution. The way of Jesus is not always going to be seen as good or accepted. There will be persecution, he says, but there also will be people who will be intrigued by you and will come to discover me, believe in me, know me, and follow me as a result of your lives. So Jesus says, be salty, arrest corruption, prevent moral decay, be light, show the world a better, different way of being. Live this out. Don't just preach it, live it. And as you live it, people will be drawn in. And then he says this. He says that for salt to work, it needs to remain salty. For salt to work, it needs to remain salty. Now, what does that mean? Craig Blomberg again, he says, this is not the scientifically impossible notion of salt becoming flavorless, but rather the common problem in the ancient world of salt being mixed with various impure substances and therefore becoming worthless as a preservative. Jesus says you have to remain distinct from the world and the culture around you to effect change, to be a force for good. Jesus is saying if you want to be a force for good, you must remain pure. The church must remain pure. That is, she must keep Jesus at the center. We must be seeking, pursuing, following Jesus. And not anything else, not power or privilege or cultural acceptance or nationalism or greed or revenge or self-glory. We need to be seeking, pursuing, and following Jesus. Unfortunately, tragically, many times in history, too many times in history, the church has not pursued Jesus. The church has not been pure, but has instead allowed impure substances to corrupt her. She has followed greed and power and control and privilege and ideologies of the left and the right, human wisdom rather than Jesus. And it has resulted in some horrific, evil things happening that have damaged the church's witness. Now, thankfully, Jesus is building his church. If it was up to us, the church would probably be gone by now. But thankfully, Jesus and the Spirit are behind the church and building the church, and it's not all up to us. But there's a challenge here for us. You are to be a force for good in the world, and to be a force for good in the world, Jesus must remain at the center. To do justice in a distinctly, uniquely Christian way, Jesus must be at the center. Jesus must be who we're seeking and pursuing and following. If Jesus is at the center, what does it look like? What does it look like if Jesus is at the center? 3 things. And the 4th thing, love, is what we'll talk about next week. So for this week, 3 things. Number 1, if Jesus is at the center, we will be category defying. If Jesus is at the center, we will be category defying. Now, what do I mean by that? Larry Hurtado wrote this book. He's a scholar, historian, church historian, and he wrote this book called The Destroyer of the Gods, Early Christian Distinctiveness in the Roman World. And he says many things, but he pulls out 5 things that he said made the Christians very distinct from the culture around them, from the Roman culture that surrounded them. He says, number 1, they were the most diverse community that the world had ever seen. You walked into a church in the Roman world, and it was made up of Jew and Gentiles. It was made up of people from multiple ethnicities. It was made up of the wealthy and the poor. It was made up of masters and slaves and freedmen, people of all languages. It was very, very diverse. Not just diverse at the universal global church level, but diverse even at the local church level. Churches were multicultural and multi-ethnic. They were melting pots. And these people all came together around Jesus. And they treated each other as family. The things that would normally divide people out in the world or create hostility between people out in the world, they didn't in the church. Everyone came together with Jesus at the center, and they treated each other as brothers and sisters. Not perfectly all of the time, of course, but in a way that was not happening with any other group or any other community in the wider Roman culture. They were diverse. Number two, Larry Hurtado says the church was highly generous and committed to caring for the poor, and not just their own poor, but everybody's poor. The early Christians were radically generous, and when we read history, we see that this is true. In the Roman Empire, there were multiple plagues that struck the empire and obviously struck the cities most significantly, just because of the volume, the concentration of people that lived in the cities, and because of how filthy the cities were. Really, plagues struck the cities, and the non-Christians, the non-followers of Jesus, fled the cities. And they left even their loved ones, their spouses, their children, their parents, to die. And what we know from history is that the Christians didn't flee. Some fled, maybe, but a lot of them didn't. They remained in the cities, and they took care of their own who were sick and dying, and of the non-Christians who were sick and dying. And many Christians died alongside non-Christians in Roman cities during the plagues. When others were abandoning them, the Christians stayed, and even some Christians moved to the city to care for everybody's sick, everybody's poor. Emperor Julian, who's often known as Julian the Apostate, he lived from 331 to 363, thereabouts. He wanted to see, you can tell from his name, Julian the Apostate, he wanted to see the end of Christianity. He wanted Greek thought and the Greek way of life to win the day and not Christianity, but he was constantly frustrated. And he says this, "It is disgraceful that the impious Galileans support not only their own poor, but ours as well. All men see that our people lack aid from us." He wanted to dismantle Christianity, but he couldn't help but realize that the Christians supported everybody's poor. The Romans didn't do anything to help anybody. They didn't help their own poor, but the Christians did. They helped not just their own people, not just their own poor, but others as well. And you read on in history, and the Christians cared for the poor and the homeless, strangers and refugees, the elderly and infirm, orphans, the sick, lepers, who really were a very marginalized, socially outcast group. The Christians took them in and treated them with dignity and cared for them. The Christians started homeless shelters and hospitals and orphanages. It was Christians who did these things in the West. And so we see from history, the Christians were an incredibly diverse community, and they were a radically generous, sacrificial group of people, and not just for their own poor, but for everybody's poor. Not just for their own families, but for the wider society as well. So Larry Hurtado says they were radically generous, they were diverse, and then he says they were non-retaliatory as well. The early Christians stood out in that they forgave their enemies. They didn't treat people the way that they deserve to be treated. If you burn down my house, I'm not going to go and burn down yours. If you kill my family, I'm not going to go and kill your family. The early Christians were against killing. They were against violence. And they didn't just forgive their enemies, they sought out ways to love their enemies. to bless those and pray for those who persecuted and oppressed them. It was radical. Another thing Larry Hurtado says, they were against abortion and they were against infanticide. Christians have not just been against abortion or pro-life in recent years, they were as far back as the first century. Now, in the first century, abortion was much more dangerous, and so it didn't happen as often. Infanticide was much more common, and if you had an unwanted pregnancy, often what happened was babies were just left exposed to the elements, to either die or be taken into slavery. And the church opposed abortion and infanticide. They didn't want to see it happen in their midst. And if they found children left exposed to the elements, they put their money where their mouth was, so to speak. They didn't leave those children there. They took those children into their own homes. They adopted them and made them members of their own households, their own families. So adoption is a thing that the early Christians were passionate about as well. They were diverse, they were radically generous, they were non-retaliatory, they were against abortion and infanticide, and lastly, they were sexually countercultural. The first sexual revolution didn't happen in the 60s in North America or the West. It was Christian. The first sexual revolution was Christian. In ancient Greek and Roman culture, it was widely accepted that husbands would have sex with male and female mistresses, concubines, slaves, and prostitutes. An ancient Athenian saying was, wives are for legal heirs, prostitutes are for pleasure. Sexual violence against poor and powerless women was also widely accepted because they were regarded as social non-persons. They were not thought to have any legal rights that could be violated. For a slave to resist the sexual advances of her or his master meant death. So there was a very low view of sex and of people's rights and of consent and of all of that in the early Roman world. In sharp contrast to all of this, Christianity taught that sex was not just an appetite. It did not exist for mere physical gratification. It is a divine gift meant to literally, physically unite a man and a woman who have committed their whole lives and their whole selves to each other in an exclusive covenant. Sex is not about self-gratification in Christian theology. It's about mutual self-giving. And as one author I was reading put it, you don't unite with someone physically in Christian theology, again, unless you are also willing to unite with the person emotionally, personally, socially, economically, and legally. Don't become physically naked and vulnerable to the other person without becoming vulnerable in every other way, because you have given up your freedom and bound yourself in marriage. The Christians had a very high, very sacred view of sex, and it was an incredibly strict ethic by the standards of the Romans that lived around them. So there were many other ways they were distinct, but these are the things Larry Hurtado points out. Diverse, radically generous, non-retaliatory, love of enemies, against abortion and infanticide, and they had a strict sexual ethic that they didn't impose on other people, but that they felt they needed to do to honor and please and emulate and follow Jesus. And it's interesting, the more Christianized Rome became, the more there were laws against sexual slavery. And one historian has actually noted that you can actually judge just how Christianized an ancient society was by how strictly it forbade sexual slavery. I mean, we live in a day and age where human trafficking and sex slavery is still a thing. The Christians challenged this in the first centuries, and we need to continue to challenge it today. Now, here's the thing. That's a neat history lesson, but what's that got to do with what I'm saying? And don't worry, you're like, Dave's got 3 points, and he's still on point number 1. Point number 1 will be the longest, and the next 2 will be much shorter. Tim Keller analyzes Larry Hurtado's work, and he says this, that the first 2 distinctives, they sound a lot like the values of liberals. By modern day standards, the first 2 distinctives of diversity and radical generosity those are a lot like the values of liberals: diversity, equality, racial justice and reconciliation, care for the poor, alleviation of poverty and suffering. Those are things that over the last few decades have become associated with liberalism. He says the last two distinctives sound like the values of conservatives, traditionally the values of conservatives: pro-life, sanctity of human life, pro-marriage, and pro-family. And then he says the middle one doesn't sound like anybody. The non-retaliatory enemy love, that doesn't sound like anybody. Nobody's really practicing that. And so Tim Keller says the early Christians were, by our standards, too liberal for the conservatives, and too conservative for the liberals, and too something else for the both of them. They were the best of both and something else entirely. They were category defying. And I think we need to be that again. In the 21st century, we need to be category defying. The way of Jesus, hear me, the way of Jesus is neither liberal nor conservative. It's neither Democrat nor Republican. It's neither left nor right. It is not comfortably at home in any one political party. It is not wholly represented by any one political platform. The way of Jesus is not about one issue. It doesn't need political endorsement, and it doesn't even need a favorable political, social climate to survive and thrive. And I feel like, we seem to have forgotten that. Now here's the thing, we live in a difficult day and age in the West, where progress or progressivism seems to involve, for many, an aggressive dismantling of Christendom and the building of a brave new world where Christianity is not influential or foundational. The Christianity that is welcomed at the table is one that has adapted, that has shed some of its beliefs, adapted some of its beliefs to make it more culturally palpable. As a result, for many conservative Christians, a lot of what comes from the left or a lot of what comes from progressives is viewed with suspicion or as just outright rejected. The left is seen as the enemy for many conservative Christians. This is unfortunate. Because as I've said in previous sermons, especially when we were going through the Resilience series, this is unfortunate because Christendom was far from perfect. That's why there needed to be so many revivals and renewals and awakenings, because Christendom got off track several times in horrific ways. There was a lot that happened in Christendom that was inconsistent with the way of Jesus. So there are wrongs in the past that need to be addressed and righted. Wrongs in the past that are affecting the present, and they need to be addressed and they need to be righted, but many Christians defensively push back against any of that. Now, the right promises, in essence, to preserve something of Christendom. And so many Christians, for the sake of comfort, for the sake of the preservation of their way of life, they lean and they vote right. Not everybody, but I think if we search our hearts, we'll see that that is, at least subconsciously, playing in the background in some of our political decisions. We want to preserve our comfort and our way of life. Christians, as a result, lean and vote right. Christians have moved away from being category defying and are increasingly associating their faith too closely with the politics of the right. And we're losing our uniqueness, we're losing our distinctiveness, we're losing our witness in the midst of this. Christianity is becoming too political in the wrong ways. Now, are there Christians doing that on the other side, on the left? Absolutely. But I'm not going to speak from their perspective, all right? I've grown up in conservative church circles. I'm a conservative Christian. This is my crew. So I'm going to talk about my crew, all right? How does this play out, this polarization, this fragmentation that I'm talking about? How does this play out, especially in the arena of justice? Well, one way it plays out is that oftentimes as conservative Christians, we don't contend for certain issues or even enter into dialogue on certain issues because we believe that they are leftist, progressive issues. If it's coming from the left, there's no conversation. If it's coming from the left, we won't even think about it. If it's coming from the left, it just gets shut down right away. Right? We won't even enter into conversations about white privilege or white fragility or intersectionality or systemic or institutional racism or reparations and what that could look like, or even the idea of anti-racism, that it's not enough to just not be racist personally. You have to be anti-racist. You have to actually fight against racism in the world. Fight against it in yourself and fight against it in institutions. You have to be anti-racist. You have to deliberately make decisions that are anti-racist. The left is talking a lot about all of these things, and conservative Christians don't want to talk about any of it because it's coming from the left. But I just want to say this. There's a lot of value in these things. There's a conversation to be had here. There's things to learn. There's things to ponder and consider. There are things here that I believe are consistent with the heart of Jesus. Now, we can critique how far some of it goes, but I think just outright rejecting all of it and not talking about it and saying that's leftist progressive doesn't get us anywhere. It doesn't get us anywhere. And so there are lots of issues we're not engaging with, lots of conversations we're not having, lots of things we're not doing, and not for righteous reasons, but just because of defensiveness and fear, and because we don't want to be uncomfortable, and because it's coming from the enemy, so to speak. Now here's the thing, we sometimes put a religious veneer on our tunnel vision or our narrow-mindedness. We say we're being spiritual people. We're transcending politics. Don't bother me with earthly politics and earthly social issues. I transcend these things. I'm a spiritual person, part of a spiritual people. But here's the thing. By not addressing social issues, we are opting for the status quo. We're actually casting our vote for the status quo. A way I heard it put recently, I really like it, to not be political is to be political. Inactivity does not mean that you are not political. You are still being political. You're just opting for or voting for the status quo. Martin Luther King, this is a famous quote of his. He says, "I must confess that over the last few years I have been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that our greatest stumbling block in the stride toward freedom is not the white citizens' counselor or the Ku Klux Klan, but the white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, 'I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I can't agree with your methods of direct action,' who paternalistically feels he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by the myth of time and who constantly advises to wait until a more convenient season. Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. Lukewarm acceptance is much more bewildering than outright rejection." To not be political is to be political. So one way we see this play out is we just won't enter into conversations, we just reject certain ideas, propositions, solutions, because they come from the left. Another way we see this play out is we become so focused on preserving our way of life as conservative Christians that we turn a blind eye to the injustices of our own side, the injustices that our side perpetuates, or the ways in which our side is inconvenient with the way of Jesus. By saying that the left, the progressives, they are dismantling Christianity, they want to put Christianity to death, they are the enemy. The right wants to preserve our comfort and way of life. We'll go with the right. By saying that, we are in essence sometimes subconsciously assuming that the right is godly, the right is Christian, the right is righteous, and the left is not. And so we are full of criticism for the left, but we have no criticism for the right. We have no introspection or self-reflection. We have the inability to look at our own team, our own side, and say there are things happening over here that are unjust, that are wrong, that are inconsistent with the way of Jesus. There are ways that we are doing things that are not pleasing to God and that are not actually working for the thriving and flourishing of all peoples. We become blind. Another way we see it play out, we don't join worthy causes or movements because leftists are involved, but we miss out on doing good work by doing that. We have this attitude that I cannot work with anybody unless they agree with me on absolutely everything and I agree with them on absolutely everything. Guess what? You'll never be able to work with anybody on anything. Nothing will get accomplished if that is our mindset. There is a lot of good work that's being done by progressives, by leftists, work that the church should be doing. And we're just not getting involved at all because of who else is involved. Now, here's the thing. Theologically, I believe in this thing called common grace. Common grace. That is that because we are all made in the image of God, even though that image has been fractured and marred by the fall, since we're all made in the image of God, there's truth everywhere. There's truth everywhere. We can learn from anybody, and people are capable of doing good things, whether they have the Spirit or not. Now, there's so much more that could be said on that topic, so don't let that be my final word on that topic. But my point is, if you believe in common grace, it shouldn't surprise you that people that have a different worldview from you are doing good things and are saying things that are helpful and wise and that we can learn from. That we can learn from. And so there's work that we should be doing that we just don't do because of who's involved. And we miss out on good work. Work that I think Jesus would be pleased with us doing. And an example of this is Black Lives Matter. Micah Edmondson, black pastor, in his essay, Is Black Lives Matter the New Civil Rights Movement? Now he wrote this, he's a member of the Gospel Coalition, and he wrote this for the Gospel Coalition. If you know anything about the Gospel Coalition, they are not theological liberals. They are theologically conservative. And he writes this for them. I strongly recommend full engagement with the concept of Black Lives Matter and critical engagement with the movement, especially since there's no evangelical alternative to Black Lives Matter. It grieves me deeply to say there's no evangelical movement robustly, consistently, and practically affirming the value of disparaged black people. So we must be careful how we criticize Black Lives Matter in the absence of an evangelical alternative. Black Lives Matter has been rejected by many Christians because it's not an explicitly Christian movement and because some of the people involved disagree with us ethically on other things. And so we're just not going to get involved in this. And Micah steps into that and he says, there's no evangelical alternative to this right now. And while we can't agree with everything, we can most certainly agree that Black Lives Matter, and this group is saying something and doing something, and so to some degree, we need to get involved in this. We can't just push it away and reject it. We need to get involved in this. Now, will there be limits as followers of Christ on how far we can go with certain movements? Yes. Will there be times where we will not be welcome at certain tables or in certain rooms because we're followers of Jesus, because of our beliefs? Yes. But that's on them. Don't let it be us that didn't even try. Another way we see this polarization and fragmentation playing out, we might hinder justice for or even advance injustice towards one or more groups of people out of blind loyalty to our tribe or our team. So we've got to have our team win, we've got to have our person in power, and so we will just accept that some injustices are going to come about as a result of this. And that's okay, because we'll get what we want, even if it means other groups of people are going to suffer as a result. Christians are getting caught up in all of this, and it is affecting our witness. It's affecting our witness not just with the wider world, but within the church as well. Young people, millennials, are passionate about justice. And unfortunately, many traditional conservative churches are not passionate about justice, and we're pushing young people away. We're losing them. They're going to go where the fight is. They're going to go where the fight is. I remember preaching on social issues and having people come up to me afterwards and say, "Don't preach social issues, just preach the Bible. Don't preach social issues, just preach the Bible." I don't know how you can preach the Bible and not preach about social issues, but for a lot of young people, they don't see a distinction between those things. They see justice as inherently biblical. They see justice as the way of Jesus. And we talked over the last 2 weeks about how that's accurate, how that's true. The prophets talk so much about justice. Jesus talks so much about justice. The early church was passionate about justice, and we're choosing not to be. We're choosing to shut our eyes and shut our ears out of fear sometimes of the progressive agenda, out of fear of the social gospel, out of fear of these things. We just close off this whole part of the Bible and the Christian life, and our young people are seeing that as narrow-mindedness. They're seeing that as injustice. They're seeing that as apathy and indifference, and they're getting pushed away. And they're going to go where the fight is, and it breaks my heart, but the fight is largely being fought by people who do not preach the gospel. A lot of young people, they don't want to give up their Christian faith, but they want to fight for justice, so they go to churches where there's a veneer of religiosity, but where justice is happening. But a lot of these churches where justice is happening are theologically liberal, denying things that we would say are fundamental and essential to the Christian faith. And unfortunately, as our young people spend time there, they get involved in really good things. But they're not discipled properly, and their faith is chipped away at, and they eventually become theologically liberal themselves, or they just fully go over to secularism. And we lament that and decry that, but in many ways we've pushed them there. We've pushed them there. Micah Edmondson, again in his essay, he addresses the fact that a lot of Christians criticize Martin Luther King Jr. for being theologically liberal. A lot of conservative Christians criticize him for being theologically liberal. And he says this: Martin Luther King Jr., in his early days, he wanted to ground his fight for equal rights in theology and in the Bible, but he couldn't access conservative seminaries like Southern Baptist and Westminster. And there were no theological resources affirming the value of black life. The only people doing work on this were the theological liberals. And so he went to their seminaries, he read their books, he used their resources to build his foundation. So we're criticizing, as conservatives, MLK for his liberalism, but we pushed him there. We pushed him there. The liberals are the ones often addressing these issues, and we're not. So all of this is affecting our witness, not just with the wider world, but it's affecting our witness within the church and with upcoming generations. So I say it again, as Christians, if Jesus is at the center, we will be category defying. We need to be category defying again. Neither left nor right, the best of both and something else entirely. If we follow Jesus, we will advocate for and do things that will shock our more conservative friends. And we will advocate for and do things that will shock our more progressive friends. We will probably almost constantly feel somewhat uncomfortable no matter where we are, but that's following Jesus. We can be the best of both worlds and something else entirely if we follow Jesus. And it's interesting, the way that we can be something else entirely is still the way that the early church was something else entirely. Non-retaliatory. In this age of increasing fragmentation and polarization, I cast you off if you don't agree with me. I shame and humiliate you and cancel you and cut you out if you don't agree with me. In a culture like that, we can stand out by being radically loving of all people, no matter who they are, whether they believe with us or not, whether they're on our side or not. Right? Whether they see the world the same way as we do or not, we can still radically love them. Jesus calls us to radically love absolutely everybody, no matter their religion or ethnicity or income level or education or gender identity or sexual orientation or any of these things. We are called to radically love everybody as image bearers of God. We are called even to love our enemies, to pray for and bless those who persecute us. If we do that, we will be something else entirely from what we're seeing in our culture right now. So we need to be category defying again. If Jesus is at the center, we will be. If we're not following the left or the right, but following Jesus, we will be category defying. The second thing, and don't worry, these next 2 points will be much shorter. If Jesus is at the center, the gospel will be our motive. The gospel will be our motive. And I won't belabor this point because I've made it several times in past sermons. We forgive because we're forgiven. We're generous because God has been radically generous to us. We're gracious because God has been abundantly gracious to us. We're patient because God has been incredibly patient with us. We suffer for the good of others because God suffered for our good. We give our lives for others because God gave his life for us. We help the homeless because spiritually we were without a home and God brought us home. We help the poor because spiritually we were impoverished and God through Jesus made us rich. We are passionate about adoption because we've been adopted into the family of God. We take on the plight and the problems of others, the burdens of others, because Jesus took our burdens on himself and gave of himself to fix our problem. Right? If the gospel fully and truly understood, if we get that, we will be just people. We will be just people. The gospel needs to be our motive. Number 3, if Jesus is at the center, we will emphasize heart change. If Jesus is at the center, we will be category defying, the gospel will be our motive, and we will emphasize heart change. Just a quick story from Luke chapter 19, the story of Zacchaeus. He, Jesus, entered Jericho and was passing through, and there was a man called by the name of Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector, and he was rich. Zacchaeus was trying to see who Jesus was and was unable because of the crowd, for he was small in stature. So he ran on ahead and climbed up into a sycamore tree in order to see him, for he was about to pass through that way. And when Jesus came to the place, he looked up and said to him, Zacchaeus, hurry and come down, for today I must stay at your house. And he hurried and came down and received him gladly. And when they saw it, they all began to grumble, saying, he has gone to be the guest of a man who is a sinner. And Zacchaeus stopped and said to the Lord, Behold, Lord, half of my possessions I will give to the poor, and if I have defrauded anyone of anything, I will give back 4 times as much. And Jesus said to him, Today salvation has come to this house, because he too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man has come to seek and to save that which was lost. Zacchaeus was a tax collector. And tax collectors were despised in Jesus' time. They were Jews who worked for the Romans, who collected taxes from their fellow Jews for the Romans. So they were seen as traitors. They were employees of the occupying force, of the oppressors. But they were also hated because they took more than they were supposed to. They didn't just collect what was actually required by Rome. They collected even more, and they pocketed the difference, and they made themselves incredibly rich and wealthy. So they bankrupted and impoverished their own people. They didn't just work for the oppressors, they were oppressors themselves. Zacchaeus is an agent of injustice. And Jesus goes over to Zacchaeus' house and spends time with him. And Zacchaeus is convicted of his life. And he seeks to make amends. He says, I will give half of my possessions to the poor, and anyone that I've defrauded, and he probably defrauded a lot of people, anyone that I have defrauded, I will give them back 4 times as much as I took. Now, Zacchaeus didn't do these things because Jesus shamed and humiliated him. Zacchaeus did these things because he was radically altered and changed by the love of Jesus. He had a radical encounter with the fatherly love of God through Jesus, the grace of God through Jesus, the mercy of God through Jesus, and it changed him as a person. It changed his heart, and he went from being an agent of injustice to being an agent of justice. And not just to saying, I'm sorry, but to repairing the damage that he had done and seeking to live differently. His heart was transformed. And as followers of Jesus, we need to emphasize transformation of the heart through a radical encounter with the love of Jesus, with grace and with mercy. Now listen to me, laws are important. We need to advocate for just laws. I love the way Martin Luther King puts it. It may be true that the law cannot make a man love me, but it can stop him from lynching me, and I think that's pretty important. Right? Laws can stop injustices from happening, but if we want to see real societal change, if we want to go deeper than the laws and actually see people and communities and our culture renewed and transformed, we need not just laws, but heart change. And only God can do that. Only Jesus can do that. So if Jesus is at the center of our justice work, we will emphasize heart change. Now you might be saying to me, especially if you're not a Christian, many Christians are racist, David. They've had encounters with the love of Jesus and they're still racist. The church has had encounters with the love of Jesus and they still were part of slavery and all kinds of injustices in the past. So I don't think heart change is enough. But if you were here last week, if you weren't, I encourage you to go back and watch it. If you were here last week, you will remember that Peter, even though he was a follower of Jesus and a really influential, important leader in the church, even though he was all of those things, he was still racist, and Paul confronted him. But how did Paul confront him? Paul confronted him by saying, Peter, you haven't understood the gospel enough. You haven't understood the radical love of Jesus enough, or grace enough, or the heart of God enough. You've understood it quite a bit, but you're still falling short of understanding the fullness of it and its implications for your life. So yes, people who have encounters with Jesus can still very much be unjust, sinful people. But that's not because the love of Jesus isn't enough. It's because they haven't gone deep enough with it. And so I think people, Christians, they still need heart change. They need deeper encounters with Jesus and his love. So if Jesus is at the center of our justice efforts, we will be category defying, the gospel will be our motive, and we will emphasize heart change. Lastly, we will live out of love even for our enemies, and that's what we'll talk about next week. Let's pray. God, thank you for this time together. Thank you for these challenging words from your word. And God, I just pray that you would do in our lives whatever is necessary to be done. In Jesus' name, amen. Thanks again, everyone, for being here. God bless.